always learn, so always stay updated of what's happening. The industry is not what it used to be 10 years ago. Lots of the tools that we're talking about are not what they used to be. Don't feel attached to any process or any experience that you've built. Sometimes we have an inherent sense of ownership. Uh, we're proud of a certain experience or a certain interaction that we've built in our company or a certain way of working.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to a whole new episode of Engati CX. I'm your host, Nishita, and today we have a customer experience expert with us on the show. But before I introduce to our guest, allow me to introduce you to the magic of Engati. Engati is the world's leading multilingual no-code digital customer experience platform available across 14 channels with 48,000 solutions created across 186 countries in every domain and use case. Engati has been recognized as one of the top platforms by INC.com, TechWorld, CIO, and many others. We run the Engati blog, the video channel, and the Engati CX podcast, receiving upwards of 400,000 visitors annually. And now, moving on to our guest. Olga Budieri is the global head of customer experience for Aramex. As a customer experience professional and with a profound understanding in the supply chain and logistics, Olga has worked on Greenfield as well as several legacy customer experience projects, leveraging current and new tools into the next generation of customer service and experience. Coming from an IE and MBA background with CX on her mind, Olga believes the future is already here. From smart stores to AR guided employee experiences within organizations, the calls to arms for the CX battleground has sounded. Welcome, Olga. So excited for this interview today.
Hello, Nishita. Great to be here. Thanks for the shout out for the Engati team for the invite.
It's our pleasure. So before we dive into our interview with Olga, do not forget to subscribe to Engati and tap the bell icon to get exclusive content from thought leaders across the globe. So let's get ready with the first question, Olga. How different is the customer ecosystem in the supply chain and logistics industry when compared with the customer ecosystem in general across?
Thanks for that question. It's a brilliant one, actually. So when you're working in logistics, and especially if you're offering a wide range of solutions, anyone is eligible to be your customer. So profiling personas can be a tricky thing to do because you have multiple businesses that deal with you, different verticals, different industries, and you span countries. So you've got lots of different cross-cultural sensitivities, diversities. So you really need to understand the complexity of that. And as a provider of solutions, you potentially have different technologies, different stages of maturity of CX in different areas, different countries. So you need to deal with that and you need to build on that in different countries and understand how does it intersect, especially for cross-border e-commerce or countries or shipments that would go internationally. So that's one thing to deal with. The other thing that you want to be very cognizant of is the changing trends that happen. And I think this is similar to other industries, but it happens a little bit faster in logistics, is impact of e-commerce, impact of other verticals, and the expectations that they set that become your customers' expectations, even though they're comparing different industries together. So it makes a lot of sense to continuously measure and understand what's happening in order to build innovative products and solutions there.
Got it. That's really well stated. So we'll move on to the next question. How does the customer experience transformation project impacts the company processes and what needs to be accommodated to redesign the process?
So I think a key thing to understand is you don't have a separate customer experience strategy. It has to connect to the company strategy. It has to connect to the overall commercial, digital operations, marketing, etc. strategy. So it's not a standalone component, and it would come from the overarching goal of your company. So whenever you're transforming a certain customer experience for B2B, B2C, or B2B2C, you need to be very aware of how that connects to the top line and what the impact will be. So you cannot really start a CX project or a transformation project without making that connection. As you become aware of it, there might be certain considerations that you need to take in place in terms of, budgeting, in terms of timeframes, in terms of maturity of the company, how the different functions intersect or interact with each other. Then there is obviously the challenge of globalizing whatever you've come up with and you've cooked in the kitchen. So you have this beautiful solution and you've transformed your flagship store, and then it's up to you to take this and roll it out across to the rest of the countries. As I mentioned, there might be different levels of maturity, different tools they are using, different considerations, or maybe different political, socio-economic conditions they are living in their own geosphere, so to speak. The other thing that you need to be really focused on when you're doing a CX transformation project, you don't want to look at technology first. So you want to have an outside-in approach and really understand what's the objective, how it will impact customer experience, how it will impact your customers, and work backwards to processes, systems, and so on and so forth. So you want to be really focused on, for example, if you're transforming retail, you don't want to look at contact center just as a separate component, but you want to look at that segment of customers that would reach contact center and reimagine retail. So why do they reach contact center in the first place? Why do they even have to call? Why do they reach social media? It's not necessarily a positive experience for them. So instead of being just focused on transforming a channel approach, you want to transform the experience. So it can be a little bit overwhelming, but connecting all of the dots will pay off in the long term. Very similarly, B2B. So you want to look at everything that's happening in the sphere. You don't want to transform just one process, one vertical. You want to understand the end-to-end perspective and maybe understand the upstream journey as well as the downstream journey. So for certain types of customers, their experience is based on their experience with us, but also their customers' experience with us because we're providing services on their behalf. So you want to have the full picture when you're doing the transformation, and maybe certain things that have been there for 10 years, 15 years, they will have to go. It can be a painful process. You'll have growing pains, but eventually, when you have that complete picture and process, it would make sense. If you focus on technology first, you'll have bits and pieces and a patchwork of solutions that might not be the optimal way to go about it.
That definitely makes sense. So, since you mentioned about the B2B approach towards it and considering your experience in B2C and B2B, how different do you think the project has to be carried out? So, what are the different strategies do you think that has to be implemented? Or, since you mentioned, right, the tools come at the end, it's people, process, and then tools. So, what's the difference that the audience would love to know actually what's the different strategies they might have to see for B2C and B2B out there?
Definitely. So that's a great question. On the market today, there's a lot of content and a lot of experts who talk about B2C. So it's all about retail, revolutionizing this piece, and it's very easy to empathize and connect with a B2C user. So because we are B2C users, so from our own frame of reference, it's very easy to create an empathy map to understand what are the pain points and start building on that. From a B2B perspective, it's not that easy. The content is not as mature as the B2C, and it's not might not be as relevant to you as a persona. The other thing that you want to look at when you're building your strategy is for B2B, you might not have just one person you're dealing with. So you need to understand who are the functions that will impact their buying decision, how do they intersect, at which point of the journey do I need to influence them, and how do you create your strategy around that? So what are the processes? And this might involve different functions, different personas. Obviously, for B2C, it will involve a lot of functions from your team. It's very easy and very quick to impact change on B2C. For B2B, because the contracts are usually annual, because you've got that renewal piece, you've got lots of outside influences, so it's much harder to move the needle on B2B. The other
That's
thing
right.
you need to understand is having the correct needle. So if you're looking at B2C and you're surveying them, you're going to get loads and volumes of feedback. But if you're looking at B2B, you're probably going to get less feedback, but each feedback has a lot of implications financially, because each response is connected to $1 million contract or a substantial amount in investment or a substantial collaboration. So understanding B2B and B2C and understanding where they come from a surface, a face value perspective makes sense. But then delving deeper into the B2B persona and understanding what that means for them personally and professionally also makes sense, because at the end of the day, after you've built your strategy, you want to understand the people you're dealing with from the B2C side. What are their aspirations and their goals, and how can you help them achieve those aspirations by building their career in their respective companies, or by augmenting their business or growing their business. So there are lots of angles to it, and you have to be very aware when you're building your strategy. Communication for B2B and B2C is completely different. So when you're communicating internally and externally, obviously B2C is very easy to communicate. Even internally, when we're building or testing lots of B2C projects or initiatives, the tone is usually friendly, it's funky, it's down that stream of design thinking, it's very collaborative. B2B, you're more serious, you're focused, you're talking about tangible results, you want to connect it to sales, revenue, GP. So there is always that element sort of looming over the project. And you have to be aware of that, because from an organizational perspective, if you're not aware of the expectations, of the power cores, of how dynamics work, the transformation project will not have any traction or impact.
That's absolutely stated right. So, but considering the generation which is becoming the decision makers in the new B2B companies as such, don't you think there has been a shift in the way the companies have to approach to market or sell their products to a for a B2B profile as such? Because the decision makers are quite young than what they used to be. So do you think that has impacted, or when it comes to a B2B mindset, the mindset remains the same, that you cannot have like a humorous content or maybe like more funky style, as you said, when it comes selling to a software or any such kind of a thing?
Definitely, it really depends on the industry. So it's very interesting that you've mentioned that, because just yesterday I was reading a study that 57% of B2B research is done on mobile by the young generation who's leading the decision or deciding on the vendors they will deal with. Depending on the industry and depending on the sensitivity of the topic or the item, that would definitely impact the tonality of it. It will impact how you want to approach them in the market. So if I were to, for example, sell or market a cold chain solution, so that's probably for medical purposes, then I would have to be really serious, because no pharma company wants to see that I'm fun and funky, because that would send the wrong message to what will happen to their shipments. But if it was for a makeup brand, if it was for a clothing brand or whatever, then that would make more sense. So it really depends on the segment and vertical, and how do you translate that into your marketing strategy? How do you translate that into your sales strategy? The same thing holds true in terms of how do you approach customers. So in the past, there was a lot of sort of, here's our sales kit and this is what we offer, and just give us a shout out if you need any help. Now it's more dedicated, more personalized. No one wants to read through a 30, 40 page sales kit. You're already as a customer, you're already informed. You know the details. You're an expert. You actually imagined how the process will work. So now it's more about having a consultant who can guide you and augment your business and tell you, or maybe inform you, how you can add value to your value chain. So to do that, what we're doing is we're really understanding each customer profile and what that looks like, and then understanding the whole value chain as an organization and saying, this is where we add value. We can provide values to you in the first mile or middle mile or last mile, and how that connects to our products and services even the terminology and the naming and the internal communication piece about it will follow. So it gives information about the demographic, as you've mentioned. So if it's a younger demographic, especially for certain verticals and sectors where, for example, tech, e-com, you see lots of startups that have scaled up. The founders, the executives are really young. But then if you look at more traditional companies, you'll find that the buyers are of sort of maybe the older generation, or maybe in a different, I would say, league or in a different mindset. So if we're talking about oil and gas, it's a different, ball game. The partnerships are really long term. There's a lot of investment that happened in terms of connecting teams, building control towers, building those escalation processes and SOPs. So the whole communication piece is very different, and the decision to renew is very different again.
That's right. So let's say if I want to start with the voice of customer program in my company. So what would be the first 5 steps that I have to start or work with?
That's a subject that's dear to my heart. So it's first of all, you need to understand which markets you will be surveying and why. So it needs to connect to the strategy. Again, so everything is connected to strategy and it's connected to your top line. So understanding the linkage of impact of satisfaction on GP, impact of satisfaction on revenue. And then you need to understand how often do you want to do this and what do you want to ask your customers and what's the purpose. So what will be the outcome of that? So I've got the results. What do I do with them? And sort of work with the stakeholders, and you have to involve a lot of the people in the company in the pre-campaign work, just sort of aligning on what do you want to measure, what does that add value to your function, how will you use it, how will you close the loop. You've identified that, you start talking about maybe channels and touch points and metrics, and how they connect together and how you will present them. And the most important piece is the communication across the organization. So you have to have a communication plan, an internal Marcom plan, where you say, this is how I approach this campaign. So you start with the top, with the executives, with the directors, with the managers, informing them what's going to happen, how the campaign will go, and getting sign off at each step. The reason is because when you have lots of touch points, you have lots of customer feedback and lots of stakeholders involved, you might have people challenging you and saying, why did we launch? It's COVID. Why are we asking our customers what they think? But it's not about knowing what's happening in good times only. You have to know what's happening all across. So this is the voice of customer. So you need to take all of that into account, and constant communication during, and post campaign is very important. Obviously, technology, having the right partner if you're doing any field work is very, very important. So you need to identify that. Once you've decided on your strategy, and you need to be always revising the program and understanding how it adds value. You can't just design the perfect voice of customer program and say, this is it. So for example, whenever traditionally we're thinking of voice of customer, we're always thinking these are the touch points, or these are the surveys we will launch, this is the campaign, this is how it looks like, etc. And we had lots of stakeholders who were challenging us. What about the account managers? What about the customer success specialists? What about our employees who are day in, day out in contact with customers? And we've incorporated that into our program. What about social media? What about the bot interactions? What about this? So you'll always have, what about this? What about this new channel? You need to understand how that fits and intersects with your program. So constant, I would say the last step is constant review and revision of the program. And you can't go and say, okay, let me finish 2021 or 2020, already in 2021 mindset. So let me finish 2020 and 2021 will start to improve. You can start now.
That's right. I think, especially the companies which have been active in providing service or talking to the customers in 2020 have a higher chance of retaining those because they stood by during the tough times. And since you mentioned social media and the feedbacks coming from the customer, so this brings me to the next question where so customers will always have feedbacks, right? And we can't expect them to have positives always. And so how would you actually go on designing a complaint management system which covers multi-web and social media channels? And do you think live chat can actually play a role in minimizing those complaints?
Definitely. That's I think a question that not a lot of companies has have cracked, and so there is no perfect complaint management system. So let's get that sort of out in the open, especially if we're talking about technology. The underlying piece is about how do you build the process and empowerment of employees around that. So understanding the different channels is one aspect. Understanding what kind of complaints you will receive is another aspect. And sometimes understanding that a request can turn into a complaint. So if someone is calling, where's my shipment? That's a request. 3 calls later, it begins to sound more like a complaint. So you need to understand how do you channel this internally, how do you create ownership within the organization, and how do you empower people to solve this. That's the very first sort of fundamental thing in design. And then you need to understand how do I even prevent these? So whoever is calling me and saying, where's my shipment? Why are they calling? Is it because they don't have enough information? They don't have enough channels that they can communicate with? Because maybe 20, 30 years ago, call center was the first point of interaction you think of. The user today will think of contacting you on maybe live chat or a bot or WhatsApp, etc., before they actually give you a call. They probably have your app or they go to your website. So it's a painful interaction for the customer, and you really need to understand why they're calling. So analyzing the different sort of requests that you will get, and categorizing what is a complaint versus what's not, because sometimes it's not straightforward. So you could have a request that's just simply saying, where's this? But the underlying tonality, the underlying pain and effort that the customer spent turns it into a complaint. And you need to understand how that fits into designing this system. The other piece that's more tricky to understand, especially with legacy technology or while you're transforming, is having that omni-channel approach to complaints. So ensuring that everything is connected and visible across all channels. Because if you have a customer who's complaining, they will reach you everywhere. So they will go to social media, they will go to your bot, they will go to live chat, they will not leave any stone untapped. They will even maybe search for who are the top executives in your company and just try to shoot them an email. So maybe even make up an email address. So they will go and see, for example, Nishita or Olga or whoever is a top executive at this company. They will say, okay, Nishita at Engati.com. They'll take their chances because they want to reach a point where their issue is resolved. So you want to understand how people are reaching you and why, and how can you make this interaction easier for them. So designing certain systems, we had to study as many as probably 10, 20,000 interactions, listening to calls, analyzing them, analyzing chat conversations, understanding when do they actually reach us and is this a complaint or not. Because a customer will not come in and say it's a complaint. They might send you a request that's a complaint, so you need to make that differentiation. Obviously, the right technology is very important once you've nailed the process and understood. But empowerment, I mean, having the right technology in place is useless if you don't have the buy-in and empowerment internally. So if the person who receives the complaint doesn't have any authority to solve it or any authority to compensate, it can be an issue. And those employees will get frustrated after a while because they are helpless. They feel like they can just process the issue, but they can't solve it. So you need to be very aware of those situations and how can you counteract that in your complaint design.
Got it. So yeah, I think you really stated it well. In installing or implementing a right tool is not a solution to designing or perfecting a system. but you need to have the right process and a resource behind it. And that's when the entire ecosystem gets successful. So, yeah, that's a great tip, I guess. So, I'll move on to the next question. How do we go about building the customer service policy? So, let's say if I want to build it for Engati, what would be the first three things that I should cover in my policy?
So that's a very interesting question, and it's a tricky one. I think documenting the process is definitely, or understanding the process that you are building this policy for is very important. So visual workflows and understanding where this policy will come into effect. Who is the owner of enforcing this policy is also very important. So who will be owning this within the organization? Who will be enforcing it? So what's the governance piece around it? That's also very, very important. And the third piece is how do you communicate it and how do you ensure that it moves from being just a document or a process that you've cooked up in the kitchen to something that everyone in the organization is aware of. Um, from an organizational perspective, even if you have, the best policy, even if you've outlined what you want to do, if you don't have an enforcement for that, if you don't have a way of governing it or monitoring it or verifying that it's actually coming into effect, it might prove to be useless. So defining what is a customer service policy, essentially, that's number one. And understanding who will own it and how will they amp it, how they will augment it, how they will build on it is important, and how will you communicate it to the people internally and make sure that they buy into it. We've had instances where people, there's a policy, it's there, it's socialized, but people are not abiding by it. So we need to understand how that connects. Bearing in mind that, of course, you've done your research, you understand what's the impact on the customer and so on and so forth. I didn't state that at the beginning because that's the obvious piece. But then how do you take that and translate that into reality? That's the challenge.
That's right. So I think we all are set to start building our customer service policy by some of your great tips. So considering your experience at Aramex or the great amount of work that you have done as a CX enthusiastic, what would be one tip that you would like to leave all of us with so that we make sure that we are working well and we provide like an excellent customer service to our audience?
So My my tip, I mean, always learn. So always stay updated of what's happening. The industry is not what it used to be 10 years ago. Lots of the tools that we're talking about are not what they used to be. Don't feel attached to any process or any experience that you've built. Sometimes we have an inherent sense of ownership. Uh, we're proud of a certain experience or a certain interaction that we've built in our company or a certain way of working. Keep an open mind. Don't be afraid to destroy what you've built and rebuild it and reimagine it.
Thank you so much. It was really great to have you on the show, Olga, and I'm sure the audience is going to love the insights that you have shared with us. So we'll be back with a new episode very soon. So stay tuned, and we'll see you around the next time. Bye bye.